the early 20th century, China was an empire with a pre-capitalist economy, ruled by the decadent Manchu dynasty. British imperialism had crushed it in the so-called Boxer Rebellion in the late 19th century. That revolution had been an uprising against foreign domination that led to territorial concessions, domination of trade and railways to one Western power after another. The fierce local uprisings were crushed by foreign weapons and sanctions were imposed, dividing China amongst the winners. China was bleeding and was a helpless spectator, victim of rivalries and conflicts over the control of the region between the powers of the different Western imperialisms and Japan. Besides the domination of foreign powers, France, Japan and England, the country was handed over to warlords, big landowners with their own armies, who warred with each other for the conquest of new territories where the peasants lived under a system compared to feudalism. In this situation, a Republican nationalist movement begins to emerge, led by Sun Yat-sen and his party, the Kuomintang, which focused on the idea of overthrowing the monarchy by a military conspiracy. This movement attracted large sections of reformers disillusioned by the empire and most of the new generation of students. The movement acquired a mass character, and in 1911 the Chinese empire fell, much more due to its own weakness than to the strength of the weak Chinese bourgeoisie. The Chinese Republic was proclaimed and Sun Yat-sen elected its first president. But the bourgeoisie was not able to carry out the transformation in the country to resolve the agrarian crisis caused by the large estates and regain national independence. The only way to protect China from the continuing raids and pressure of imperialist powers. The domains of the warlords turned into spheres of influence of the great powers. The military commanders of Yunnan and southern Guangxi were subjected to the control of France. The river valleys, economically controlled by Hong Kong and Shanghai, came under British influence. Manchuria in the north has become largely a special area of Japan. Civil wars and the reign of warlords deepened the misery in the country. Taxes increased. The land was devastated. Agricultural production decreased. China was forced to import rice and wheat. Millions of peasants were expelled from the land, and the overwhelming majority of the population was doomed to chronic hunger. But the First World War raging in Europe benefited China. It has become a major exporter of cotton, textiles, cigarettes, coal, iron ore, beans and oil. The industrial bourgeoisie was strengthened and the financial market expanded. But it also caused a numerical increase of the working class in conflict with their employers, foreign or Chinese. At the end of 1916, there were almost 1 million industrial workers, and their number had almost doubled by 1922. This young industrial proletariat took the lead of the urban masses and founded its first trade union in 1918. The Russian Revolution brought new life to the workers. Its influence led to the Chinese Communist Party's founding in 1921. At the same time, the activity of the Kuomintang took a new life. The relationship between the young Communist Party and the Nationalist Bourgeois Party would be decisive for the future course of events. The Communist Party proposed the unity of action with the Kuomintang in 1922, but this was rejected by Sun, who only accepted the entry of communists as individuals without organizational structure. Influenced by the delegate of the Third International in China, Mering, the communists entered the Kuomintang as individuals, in the hope of influencing the workers who had already joined that party to win them to communism. This alliance would be consolidated by providing money, weapons and logistical support from the Soviet Republic to the Kuomintang. One result of this cooperation was the construction of the Wumpu Military Academy. This academy was organized by Russian military advisors, but under the command of Chiang Kai-shek, a young military officer. At the beginning of 1925, the first workers' uprising explodes in China. In Shanghai, an English concession, the general strike is declared after the killing by the British police of 18 demonstrators protesting against poor working conditions and violence of the Japanese bosses. The strike spread throughout the country, and it came to Guangzhou and Hong Kong to the south and reached Beijing in the north. About 400,000 workers went on strike. There were massacres in several cities, but the strike continued. 250,000 workers left Hong Kong, the British stronghold in China, towards Canton. A movement for the boycott of British goods took place. The strike and the boycott lasted 15 months. On October the 10th, 1926, British Marines occupied the port city of Guangzhou, and the movement ends. Underpinned by the strength of the mass movement, the Kuomintang consolidated its power at the end of June 1925 and would organize a national government. In September, the troops of the Kuomintang, supported by the associations of peasants, occupy the territories of the east of the Pearl River and liberated the south of Guangdong State. The members of the Communist Party had a key role in the organization of urban workers, giving cohesion to the struggle and providing a liberation program to fight for. But the plans of the young officer Chiang Kai-shek for the communists were different than the leaders of the international thought. For him, the alliance with the communists was circumstantial. On the morning of March 20th, 1926, the troops of Chiang advance on Canton. They arrest the communist political advisors of military units and occupy the office of the Canton Strike Committee. The Soviet advisors are put under house arrest. Chiang concentrates all powers in his hands. He becomes the president of the executive committee of the party and commander-in-chief of the army. The communists are obliged to deliver the list of all party members who worked in the Kuomintang, and their participation in the steering committees is limited to 1/3. With absolute control in his hands, Chiang started a military expedition to the northern conquest of the country. This march was seen by workers as a war of liberation. An uprising of the peasant masses sweeps the reactionary armies, and the Kuomintang takes the task of occupying the land liberated by the masses. The spectacular growth of the peasant movement coincided with a wave of strikes of unparalleled depth and intensity in all major industrial cities throughout the year 1926. Most strikes were for economic demands. More than half of them were successful. At the end of the year, the wave of strikes changed from economic demands to open political struggle. When nationalist troops occupy Zhongjiang on February the 18th, 1927, less than 40 kilometers from Shanghai, the Shanghai General Union of Labour called a general strike. In 48 hours, more than 350,000 workers were on the streets. However, the Communist Party, under the guidance of the International, already under the leadership of Stalin, submits to the policy guidelines of the bourgeoisie. The slogan of the general strikes were limited to support the Northern Expedition Army, defeat Sun Jianfan, long live Chiang Kai-shek. The anti-imperial slogans disappeared. The repression by local police and the French concession was fierce. In 3 days of fighting, the blood of workers flowed freely by the streets. But the nationalist forces never left Zhongjiang. On March the 21st, the General Union of Labour starts an insurrection. The Shanghai workers take to the streets, supported by poor crowds of the city. There were about 500,000 people in struggle. The city, with the exception of the French concession, was entirely occupied by the workers. Finally, the nationalist troops enter the town and are received by communist leaders as liberators. on April the 3rd, a manifesto signed jointly by Chiang Kai-shek and Chen Duxiu, the main leader of the Communist Party, is released. It reads, "The Chinese Communist Party resolutely acknowledges that the Kuomintang and its principles are necessary for the Chinese Revolution. What China needs is the establishment of a democratic dictatorship of all the oppressed classes to handle counter-revolution, not a dictatorship of the proletariat." But the goal of Chiang Kai-shek was something else. In exchange for $15 million offered by the Shanghai bourgeoisie, his army begins a massacre against the workers on strike in the early hours of April the 12th, 1927. The shots of machine guns and rifles crackled over the city. The workers awoke to see the unthinkable and impossible happening. The raid only took the workers by surprise, as all the authorities involved had been warned in advance. All workers who resisted were killed. The rest of the activists were tied up and executed, either on the streets or in the Longhua-shu barracks. Thousands of lives of workers, urban workers and students were lost. The Chinese Revolution had been defeated by the bourgeoisie with the invaluable help of class collaboration policy of the Third International under Stalin's command.